Hey parents, thanks for tuning in. Dr. Garrett with you from Foundation Chiropractic. And today I want to talk to you about what your pediatrician probably isn't telling you, probably isn't looking for. Specifically if your child's struggling with a learning, a behavioral, or a neurodevelopmental issue. For those of you that know us, for those of you that follow us, that's our focus. Kids that are developmentally delayed, focused on learning, behavior, and neurodevelopmental type issues. And I'll get to what the pediatricians probably aren't doing here in a minute, so stick with me. I got to kind of set the foundation. But what do we know about OCD, anxiety, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, autism, tics, you name it? All those things are rooted in the brain and in the nervous system, right? That's where the issue lies. So if you're looking to improve these things, I sure hope you're looking to improve the way the brain and the nervous system is functioning. Because after all, that's what's in control of all this, right? There's a great quote by Bruce Lipton. Now, Bruce Lipton, he's a PhD biologist. And what Bruce Lipton says is the function of your nervous system, right, which is your brain and spinal cord, is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. Well, what's autism? It's the inability to perceive your environment and coordinate appropriate behavior, right? What's ADHD? Same thing. What are tics? It's the same thing. Anxiety, same thing, right? It's the inability to perceive your environment and act appropriately. So like I said, if you're looking to improve these things, I sure hope you're improving the way the nervous system and the brain can perceive and coordinate, because what will happen is the behavior will take care of itself and automatically improve. Do you notice in that quote by Bruce Lipton, behavior is the effect? It's not the cause, it's the effect, in the sense that these kids aren't perceiving they're in the classroom, they're not perceiving they're in society, and they're not perceiving things appropriately, and therefore they're not coordinating things appropriately, therefore they're not behaving appropriately. And that's why trying to change behavior, whether it be like trying to teach someone to read or teach a kid how to behave, is so hard, because it's an uphill battle. You're working backwards instead of working forwards. When you can just improve the way these kids perceive and coordinate, the behavior takes care of itself, okay? So we know all these issues are rooted in the brain. How can we impact that? And more importantly, well, how does the brain develop, okay? And this is what I'm talking about in regards to your pediatrician. So your brain develops bottom up, but your brain functions top down. What do I mean? You have two hemispheres in your brain, and those hemispheres are responsible for things like executive functions, like ability to carry out tasks, ability to learn, right? Higher functioning things take place up here, but those have to be built. See, when you're born, only about 20% of your brain has developed, right? The rest has to be developed, right? You have to develop your brain, and a lot of that happens those first 2, 3, 5 years of a child's life. So how does that happen? First and foremost, understand your brain loves movement, okay? Movement feeds your brain, movement charges your brain's batteries, movement builds pathways to your brain. A good example, just to kind of let you understand what I'm talking about, is if any of you exercise, after you exercise, do you have more or less mental clarity? You have more mental clarity, right? That's because you moved, you exercised, and that movement fed your brain, it charged your brain's batteries, okay? So we know movement is great for the brain loves movement. Okay? Well, when you're born, like I said, your brain hasn't really developed yet, but you have a brain stem, okay? And this is how the brain develops bottom up. The brain stem's right, this thing right here, okay? When you're born, you have primitive reflexes in your brain stem, okay? A common one is the rooting reflex, right? You do this to a newborn, what do? They reflexively move their mouth, right? You do this to a child, they grasp, the palmar grasp. What's happening is every time that child senses that and grasps, it's building pathways to their brain. Okay, it's building the pathways to their brain. So after 6 months of age, these reflexes should go away. The brain should be strong enough to where if you do this to a child, the child's brain should be able to say, okay, you don't have to reflexively move, right? I know how to use my hands, so those reflexes go away. So primitive reflexes are a great indicator on the maturity and the development of the brain. Well, guess what we find, and I can confidently say 95% of the kids that come into our office with learning, behavior, neurodevelopmental issues, they still have primitive reflexes present, okay? These kids could be 13, 14 years old, struggling with ADHD, right? And they still have primitive reflexes present. Well, if you have primitive reflexes present, what is that showing us? It's showing us that there's immaturity in the brainstem, right? Those reflexes didn't go away. For whatever reason, those pathways weren't built. Well, if the reflexes didn't go away in the brainstem, we know what? We know the brain didn't fully develop, right? Because the primitive reflexes build the brain. So if there's primitive reflexes present, we have weaknesses in the brain. So what do we have? So, it's no wonder these kids struggle, right, with behavior and learning type issues, right? No wonder they can't perceive and coordinate appropriate behavior. There's literally immaturity in the brain. So, like I said, it goes back to, if you're going to improve this stuff, I hope you're improving the way the brain functions, right? So what we have to do is we have to strengthen those weak areas of the brain. And how we do that is with adjustments, and then we do other specific exercises as well, because like we said, movement builds the brain, right? So just understand that, your pediatrician might say, your kid has autism, your kid has ADHD, your kid has sensory issues. Okay, well, do you check for primitive reflexes? Because if you don't, we know there's immaturity in the brain, and we should probably check for those, because if we find those, we can fix those in a lot of cases. And what we can do is we can rebuild the brain, because the brain is what they call neuroplastic. What that means is your brain is always learning. It's always learning new things. It's always becoming programmed one way or the other. So where your child may be struggling right now, they may be programmed in an immature way, right? So we want to reprogram them, right? So the brain can relearn if we're teaching it the right things, and that's exactly what we do in our office. We rebuild the brain. So what we find, not only with a lot of kids do they have primitive reflexes present, but I also want to explain to you the two parts to each hemisphere of your brain. I'm sorry if you can't see that very good. It doesn't look like you can, but each hemisphere of your brain is responsible for different things. Your right hemisphere of your brain is responsible for sustained attention, safe actions, and it's the sensory part of the brain. Whereas your left brain is more short-term attention, impulsive, and that's the motor part of the brain, okay? So not only do we see kids that typically have immaturity in the sense that they still have primitive reflexes present, but we also find an imbalance side to side. See, the way the brain's supposed to work is each side, they talk together, right? And if one side wants to do something, the other side disagrees with it, it cancels itself out, right? It works synergistically between the two hemispheres, and when that happens, you get good behavior, good academics, and things like that. What we often find is in these neurodevelopmental kids, or kids with learning and behavior issues, is that one side of the brain is actually stronger than the other as well. Most common, again, is typically the left brain is strong and the right brain is weak. We usually just call it a rusty right brain, right? Rusty right brain. So if you have a rusty right brain and a strong left brain, guess what? The left brain is responsible for short-term attention. So these kids are going to have short-term attention, right? Because the left brain is short-term attention. Whereas ideally, when they're equal, the right brain would say, hey, let's sustain attention, right? But the right brain's weak in this case, right? So the right brain's not able to cancel out this short-term attention. Not only that, the left brain's very impulsive. So they have short-term attention, right? They're very impulsive, and this is the motor system. So do you see how, and also the right brain sensory, well, that's weak, so you can see how they have some sensory issues, right? See, so you have to know the neurology to really understand these things and then be able to break it down and figure out, okay, do these kids have primitive reflexes present? If they do, we know there's immaturity in the brain, which means that there's room to grow, right? There's room for improvement. So that's kind of a positive thing in the sense that when we find them, we know we can improve them and get these kids better. And then we need to figure out, okay, not only is there immaturity, but is there an imbalance side to side, right? Is one side of the brain stronger than the other? And if so, adjustments on certain sides of the spine and body can strengthen that whichever side of the brain is weak, whichever one we need to build. So what we commonly see in this office is that these kids are struggling because of immaturity and an imbalance side to side, right? It's an immature and an unregulated nervous system. And that's what you have to improve, and that's what we do every single day, and that's why we get the results that we do in our office. So I want to take you through this pyramid real quick. This is how the brain develops again, okay? It's kind of a rehash real quick. You start with primitive reflexes, okay? This says PRs, primitive reflex. This says S/M. What do I mean? There's sensory and motor system, okay? When you do these primitive reflexes, the kid has to sense it, right? And the kid has to move. So there's a sensory and motor component to the primitive reflexes as well at the bottom of the pyramid. But what happens is primitive reflexes are the start, right? They're building the brain, building pathways to the brain. When those go away at 6 months of age, the sensory and motor system, the second part, kicks in even more because kids begin to crawl, right? They're crawling more, they begin to walk, so there's even more sensory, there's even more motor. And what that does is, since we know movement builds the brain, that sensory motor system actually builds the top of the pyramid, which is cognition and the ability to learn, right? So while everybody else is doing things backwards, or everybody else is trying to teach kids how to read, teach kids how to behave, right? Teach, they're starting at the top of the pyramid, but the problem's at the bottom. Right? The problem is these kids still have primitive reflexes present. Their sensory motor system isn't as strong as it should. So it kind of leads back to that quote, when you can improve the way a kid can perceive and coordinate, behavior will automatically improve itself. When you can improve primitive reflexes to build the brain, and you can improve that sensory motor system, and you can balance the hemispheres of the brain, these kids then have the cognitive ability where they can be taught how to read, and they can read, and they can be taught how to behave, and they will behave better. All learning and academic issues lie right here on this chalkboard, and specifically in this pyramid right here. If primitive reflexes are present and the sensory motor system's off, these kids don't have the cognition. For whatever reason, their brain just didn't fully develop the way that we want it to, and therefore these kids are going to struggle. But the great news is neuroplasticity, right? Like I said, these kids can become rewired. We can reprogram these kids. The brain can always learn. We think up until about the age of 40. So if you're a parent out there and your child's been struggling, give us a call, okay? Here's why I know you can do it. You want what's best for your child, right? Let's make 2018 the best year yet. Consultations are free. If you just want to come in, sit down with me, I'll explain more about what we do. I'll kind of get a history on your child. We'll talk about where your child's been, where they are now, where you want them to go. And I'll see if we can't help make 2018 their best year yet. Thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning in. Please share. And like I said, if you're interested, give us a call, 630-608-2885. Thanks again.